This afternoon, we have the pleasure of having 4 of our Mandel School field instructors here with us to share their own perspectives on how to be successful and effective with students in field education. So I'd like to welcome Meister, who is the Director of Community Engagement from Neighborhood Family Practice Community Health Centers. McNamara is the Director of the Cleveland Department on Aging. Wenger is the Director of Transitional Living Programs at Bellefaire. And LaMarca is the Clinical Director for Community Assessment and Treatment Services. So please join me in welcoming and thanking our panelists for this afternoon. I will turn it back over to Marion to start off our discussion.
So what we wanted to do was really mine the practice wisdom of expert field instructors. And so Amy and I discussed this idea of having 4 experts who've had a lot of experience to talk about really what they've discovered as best practices. And so what we thought was we will have each person present, and then we can have some discussion and some discussion back and forth from the floor. So shall we begin with you, Megan?
Sure. Can everybody hear me? I feel like I told the gentleman, a secret agent. So, just not very secret, I suppose. So thank you very much, and thank you to our wonderful friends at MSSA for hosting us today and hosting this fantastic opportunity for field instructors as well. So I have been a field instructor. I'm an alum of MSSA from a number of years ago. And I just ran into a student that graduated last year, and I was like, oh, that was some time ago as well for me. But I had a tremendous field experience as a student. My background is in community development and community practice. So I speak a lot to the macro and meso practices. And I was at a field placement at Slavic Village Development 10 plus years ago, and had a wonderful, wonderful supervisor. And that experience, I think we heard a lot from this morning and from each other in our conversations, how much that influences you and your work down the road. And so since then, I've been working in community development, and then more recently, obviously, in community engagement and community development in the nonprofit health sector here in Cleveland at Neighborhood Family Practice. So I've had the good fortune of having a number of students the past 10 plus years. And so that has really been a great experience for me, both learning. And so we talked a little bit about how we could share some of our experiences, especially around different practices or principles that we all utilize that better serve the students that we work with. So a couple key ones came to mind for me. So one of the things that I really focus on early on when I actually meet with and interview with the students, because I think of it, they're interviewing me as well, you know, it's kind of in tandem there as us interviewing them, is recognizing what their passion and interests are, and identifying as part of that, as we go through not only the interview process, but eventually the learning contract, identifying projects that are beneficial both for us as an organization, certainly, but then ultimately what's really beneficial for them as a student in their learning. I've had a number of students that have transitioned from either micro practice or have done case management or been counselors, or students that were not previously social workers and coming into a macro setting, and it's kind of a different learning environment. So we really want to make sure it's a good fit. So we spend a lot of time talking with the student about what their goals are and what they really want to get out of their placement with us. And especially in a health center, they're not coming in as a public health student or coming in as a counselor or therapist in terms of a placement with me. It's more about the macro practice and in terms of how we can work together around government relations and community relations and a lot of program development and engagement with our patients and with the community. So we get a lot of really cool flexibility there. But I also recognize early on as a practice for me that's important is to identify within the placement, even if some of the learning opportunities might not be with me as the field instructor, how can I work with them to connect them to other departments within our health center, and kind of use that model like the task supervisor that we do here at MSSA sometimes to help identify unique projects. So a great example of that was a young woman who had her population she really loved working with was HIV and AIDS patients, but she also had a passion for women's health. And so while I certainly don't have medical experience or background in women's health, I connected her with our midwifery department and finding opportunities for her through programming and education within that placement, and she really enjoyed it. So. Another one is in terms of, again, and I think this is relatable for all of us, is networking and connecting, giving giving our students the opportunity to network. In my context, I go to a lot of meetings and I spend a lot of time in the community in collaborations and partnerships. And that first semester, whatever the student is, whether it's advanced standing or it's a new first-year student, is finding opportunities to do a lot of shadowing. And we spend that time early on doing the shadowing rather than focusing on like tasks and projects, because it gives the student a chance to really better understand what some of that means in the macro setting and especially in community engagement roles. And so they get really a chance to shadow, meet other community partners. We often see other MSAS students at different field placement sites as well. And that's a really unique, I think, experience for them. But it's also kind of sets the stage for learning, especially about community collaborations down the road. And then finally, the other practice I have is just being flexible. That's both not only as a schedule for me as a field instructor, but working with a student to be adaptable and flexible. So not just days and times that we work. I often ask in the interview around, are you able sometimes to work evenings and weekends? Do you like to go to community events? Which is great fun, but at the same time, it's making sure that students feel in the environment that they are supported, understanding to be flexible. Certainly I know how much I benefited from support when I had tests and exams and finals and everything all seems to culminate. And it can get overwhelming, especially as a graduate student. And so I think that's been, provides some flexibility and adaptability. But same with supervision, and I think whether it's with a student or with anyone you supervise around what their learning needs are and their learning styles. And so certainly for someone who's new, coming into any sort of new job environment or work environment is always a little stressful and nerve-wracking. So what can I do to help make them more comfortable, and how can I better support them? Do they like a little bit more hands-on approach? Not necessarily micromanaging and that sort of thing, but then talking about what do they like a little bit more hands-off? Do they want to be more observed more often, less often? What can we do to work together to accomplish their goals and support them in their efforts? And I know we spent a good amount of time talking about that as a group this afternoon. So that's what I've got for you right now. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So we really could hear in your presentation how student-centered so many of the practices were. It also strikes me that there's a lot of modeling by just being with an instructor who's so enthusiastic and upbeat and obviously passionate about your own work. So thank you, Megan. Let's move to Mary.
Thank you. Mary McNamara, I'm a proud 2003 alum of MSSA, and I am by no means an expert in being a field instructor. So I say that first. Those were kind remarks, but you know, as I reflect on past years, there's good years and there's not so good years with students. And I've had 20 plus students at this point since 2004. I was reflecting today that I wished I had written all their names down, because I've forgotten, unfortunately, many of them. The plate is very full. And at my previous employment at Fairhill Partners, I had students, and now at the City of Cleveland have students. And so in my current role, I'm the director of the Department of Aging, a part of Mayor Jackson's cabinet. And unfortunately, this is the first year since I graduated from MSSA that I've not had a student. And it really is because I am learning a new job. And so I think that's part of it, being a good instructor too, is knowing your own limits, right? Knowing when to say no when you get the call from MSSA to say, because that's gonna be a not so good year, right? You've got this tug, something that's saying I either have new responsibilities at work or I have new responsibilities at home. And taking on a student as an internship is mission, right? That's about our field and furthering that. So that's what I would say first is important, is knowing what your capacity is to be able to have someone who wants to learn everything you can give them. And so that's one lesson. Secondly, I always thought students would come to field knowing how to best utilize supervision. And I quickly, you know what, I just sort of gave up on that and decided that I was going to spend the first quarter giving them the agenda for supervision, right? Because there were things they were terrified to ask me, and I can remember that feeling. I can remember being terrified of Deb Teitelbaum at Counseling Solutions or Stephanie Fall Creek at Fairhill. Those were my two field instructors, and I like that I was terrified of them, right? Because it really kept me on task at field. They were not my friends. They were not people I was eating lunch with. My field supervisors were people that I was intimidated by. And so I know in supervision, I didn't want to sound stupid as a student. And so I come into that now really structuring supervision, because that may be the best hour we get together, where I get to learn where they have gaps in their knowledge, and I also get to learn where they have real talents that I haven't tapped into. So some ways that I've done that first semester is involves them picking a reading out of a journal, because I never come down and use the library or any of that. So I want to tap what they can bring to me. And I ask them to bring a relevant journal article, and they email it to me the day before, and then we spend 15 minutes talking about its relativity to field. And so that has been a way to add that to the agenda, that they get to pick the article, but then I'm going to read it because that's good for me, and then we're going to discuss it together. Another thing I've done in that first semester is I've taken some of those LISW practice test questions, and we've done them together. So there's all sorts of online free ones you can do, and that has helped me to know where some of their learning opportunities are, and then where their strengths are. And when we're answering the questions together, I don't always get them right? So I think it decreases their anxiety about testing, which is what I hear a lot in field. They're worried about that test. We also, and these are things I've learned over time, that I needed to bring an ethics case once a month. So I had this ethics test case that I got from some bookstore, and we just pull from it and discuss it, and it's good for me and good for them. I've also, I'll be honest, we use that supervision for them sometimes to bring feedback about time studies. When you get the sense that maybe someone's spending too much time on classwork at field, or on their phone, or any of those things. How do we help them realize the pressures we're all under? And so we usually do that at 1 week in the field, where we do a time study, and then they bring it back to me, and they can then identify and ask questions. How can you help me with this? And so that's been really helpful for me to structure supervision, at least through the first quarter, as one piece. The second lesson I have learned is to really try and cultivate curiosity. I always say that I can teach someone how to enter into the SAMS database that the state uses for older adults, or I can help them understand about a process in City Hall. But I can't always develop curiosity as much as I'd like to. And so how can I help that move along? Because they may discover something in field that may change their career path. I'm a real, sit here as someone who didn't start at MSSA thinking aging was going to be my field. And so those early opportunities that we have as field instructors to shape the path, and how do we sort of put in people's schedule. For me, I really schedule, tonight you're going to go to a city council meeting. On Wednesday, we're going to go, you're going to come to the budget meeting with me. And, sometimes they'll say, well, I'm really micro-focused. And I say, that's, the world of work is just not micro or macro. I've not experienced that since I've graduated. I wish I took a class in marketing at MSSA, right? How do you get clients to want to come to your program? So how do I cultivate curiosity, whether it's, like Megan said, giving them the opportunity to try on-call work, even if they don't think they're interested. Because you might learn in field you really like something, which is helpful, or you really don't like something, and that's really helpful, right? As we are going to soon meet all of these graduates as colleagues. And so cultivating curiosity has been one of my best practices as a field instructor. And then the last one, and this, early on in my taking in students, I tried to protect students more and didn't have them join in as much as part of the team. Because in every place I've worked, there's only been a few social workers. There's been folks from all different backgrounds. And I thought I wanted them to have more of a pure social work experience. And so now it's sort of all, the gates are open. You know, I want you to learn from the folks on my team who are out cutting grass and shoveling snow for seniors. So we go out in the field that way. So I've really embraced this idea of being part of the team from the top, whether it's Mayor Jackson, all throughout our department, and giving students the opportunity to feel part of the team. And from that, I've seen real rewards. There's a lot I regret from the early years of being a field instructor, right? Maybe there's a reason maybe it's good I don't have all those names. Because we learn a lot through this, and we learn a lot from each other, and the opportunity because we already have full plates, and so how do we maximize our full plates at work while bringing forth the next group in our proud profession? So those are my thoughts.
Well, thank you. You really do get such gems from listening to experienced people like the two of you. One of the things that Mary mentioned that has come out again and again in the research is how much we benefit as field instructors by having students come. I've never quite heard it framed in such a systematic way, where Mary is suggesting that we actually ask the students to bring us a reading, a specific reading that you review. It's a wonderful way of kind of staying up to date on cutting edge material and sharing some conceptual framework, as we were talking this morning, some conceptual ideas that you then can link to whatever it is you're doing in the field. So thank you. Thanks. And our third panelist is Benjamin.
So I'm Benjamin Wenger, and I work at Bellefaire, and I'm the director of the Transitional Living and Independent Living programs there. And so I graduated from MSSA in 2010 with Community and Social Development. So the first thing that I always do with any new intern is really sitting down with them and asking them what their trajectory is, like what their plans are for themselves, what they want to learn out of field, what experiences they think they're doing really well at, what do they think they need to learn and fine-tune and do more of and get better at. And then from there, we really set up the relationship and how I kind of function in that role and what their expectations are from me, and then I also get their expectations from them as well. So it's really being I'm a pretty transparent person with the people that I supervise, because I want to make sure that they know exactly what they're going to get out of it. So I really start with trying to be very validating in the beginning, and they know that after a month or so, we're going to get more towards a challenging, and so it starts with validation and then a lot of challenging of why did you make that decision? What happened there? Even if it was a success, still wanting to know, what was your thought process behind it? Because a well thought out mistake to me is better than a rash decision that just so happened to end okay. So I really work very close, because I made a lot of mistakes that turned out okay. And so from there, I'm like, that's not how I should do it. And I still needed to learn from that too. So I make sure that in that regard, I'm also very relatable to the people I supervise as well. Because I want to make sure that they understand that I've made some pretty bad mistakes. And that it's important to know that that's what we do as we're learning and growing. And even, 7-8 years in the field, as a social worker, I still make mistakes, and that's okay. And it's how we recover from them and work through them. And then I talk it out with my supervisor, and you guys can talk it out with me, stuff like that, and really setting that stage. I also make sure that they know I give very direct feedback as well, so there's not any feelings of ambiguity about it, what did he mean by that? When we're done with when we're done meeting, I want them to know exactly what was supposed to be covered and what I was meaning by what I was saying. That's very important to me. The second is really talking about boundaries with the young people that we are working with. Because we're working with a lot of kids and young adults who are around the same age as the students. And so I see a lot of my interns becoming very involved and attached to the students or to the clients, not in like a negative way, but I always say to them, you cannot own their successes and you cannot own their failures. It's not a direct reflection of you. And so through my little quotes that I use, it makes it so that we can have a more objective conversation. And so they'll be like, I can start a quote now with most of them, and they'll be like, oh, I know what you're going to say. So, and it gets to the point, but then it's completely objective. We use a little humor, and then we can really get to the, the meat and potatoes of what we really need to talk about, right? Like, if you can't, like I had one intern in the other day going, this client, she's just not opening up. She's just not, and I was like, okay, what strategies have you tried? And then I'm trying this, and it's got to be me. And I said, you can't own their successes, and you can't own their failures. So what does that mean now? And so then she was able to look at, well, she's having a lot of issues, and was able to really have a very interactive and objective viewpoint of it, where she could see where the client was coming from, she could see where she was coming from, and then she could also kind of project and predict what I was going to say from that conversation. So that's really important. Thirdly, for me, is also always looking at what the big picture is, right? So my concentration was community and social development, and I also have my executive MBA from another school in this area, which I will not mention. So for me, the big picture is huge, right? I hear a lot of people, and I know you guys have all heard it too, where they say productivity, oh my gosh, or like, productivity is important, because without productivity, we don't have a job, we don't have, revenue coming in, and we're not doing good work with our clients. So I always say to them, productivity is there for a reason. And if you don't know what that reason is, let's research it and find out. Additionally, any service that we provide, any intervention that we do, I make sure that they know the whole reason as to why we're doing that. So if we're billing Medicaid for a service, I make sure that they go and research Medicaid and then bring it back and we talk about it in our sessions. If we're billing like CPST or PH or whatever service they are providing, to make sure that they know exactly why that service was created, so then they in turn can always make sure they're providing the best service possible for the youth. And then always just having interactive conversations with them in any way, shape, and form. And also to make sure that they understand that accepting feedback is really important. So in the beginning, I give feedback in a much less abrasive way at times, because the young people we work with are not like, Mr. Ben, I don't think that that's the best way. They're saying like, no, you're wrong, stop talking to me about that, things like that. So we start out with being a little bit more, calm and collective. And then I say to them, I said something to you and your whole body language changed. Well, tell me about that. And my students are like, what are you talking about? And they don't notice that. And then we are able to have those more dynamic and engaging conversations that way too. So feedback is huge, and the ability for anybody to accept feedback is huge.
So I like that you introduce humor, because we can get so serious about the work we're doing. And that is clearly, the work can be so difficult and so heavy that introducing some lightness through humor is great. The other thing that you're all talking about is seeing the bigger picture, that social workers really think systemically, and that we, regardless of what level we're working at, how that's an important piece of the content that we're teaching to help our students to think that way. And so, Lou, you are our final panelist for now.
Hi, everybody. So the first thing I want to mention is that something I emphasize with students is I teach them to practice with purpose. And I'd like to say it's because I've been following Marion's work, and I know that the research supports it. But the truth of the matter is that I hate when people say, I'm eclectic, and then they can't tell you anything that they do. And so when I interview, that's just a pet peeve of mine. So I try and teach people that eclecticism is good, but that doesn't mean you don't have purpose and you don't have direction in what you're doing. So I emphasize a lot on conceptualizing the case. I will ask, when they talk about what they're doing with the client, I will ask them, why do you think this is happening? What do you think some of the causations are? And then get them to connect that to a theory, and then prompt them to say, so what are interventions associated with that theory? If this is what you think is going on, there's certain interventions we know are effective with this, and kind of prompt them to that. So I think that I tell the students it helps them to label what they're doing. It helps them to integrate field with classroom. It helps them to prepare for the exam. And it helps them to interview with picky people like me. So that's something that really guides me with them. Another thing that I really emphasize with the students is real world application, that integration with the classroom. Because, I mean, we all remember how in the classroom, we hear everything that's pure. And then in the real world, it's so messy, and it's very rarely works out that way. And I myself was unprepared for that when I started working. So I like to prepare students to get comfortable with that sloppiness and the ambiguity of it. You know, like they'll say, I tried motivational interviewing, but she kept switching changes. Like she kept having a different stage during the course of the interview. Well, that's normal. They don't come just in one stage, et cetera. So I think that's helpful for them to really apply what they're learning, to understand it's not going to be like a one-to-one application. And then finally, I try to talk to them about them talking. I like you mentioned curiosity. I love when someone's curious about something. And when I do supervision, I kind of think of it like, okay, I don't know if this analogy is going to work. Like if you've ever seen a jazz ensemble perform, they start the song out and there's a melody, and then they start going off into solos, and just when you think, oh God, you hear the melody back, and then they bring it back. So I like to encourage them to do a solo and talk about what's on their mind and what's of interest, but then draw them back to whatever the main topic is, or and tie it in. And I think that just giving them that space to talk and to explore. A lot of times I've had students that, and I'm sure you all do too, where it turns out that their real interest isn't what they're doing for you. And it's valuable to learn that. And you can still teach them to be competent at what you are doing, while encouraging them to learn more about what they found out they're really interested in.
Well, you're going to see that analogy in my next book. Credited to you. It's a great analogy. It really is. So what's so interesting here is that we really are talking about how transfer of learning from one place to the other is really very complicated. That in the classroom, material can be presented in such a clean, almost sterile way, as if it can happen in this way in the field. And that's a big critique of the evidence-based and empirically supported treatments, that in these wonderful studies, the clients all do well. And then when you try to transfer this into the real world, it often doesn't work, in part because the population that we're working with is different than the population in the study. But the key role of the field instructor is really to help students take what they have learned and playing jazz, improvise, see if they can adapt, see if there's a fit, or see if there really isn't a fit. So I'm so impressed listening to the four of you. As I have a question for you. How did you develop into such knowledgeable, sensitive intelligent field instructors. What were some of, yeah, like, what, how did you get to this point? Because there really are a lot of pearls of wisdom that I got from listening to the four of you. How did that happen? What were some of the influences?
I think our experiences probably mirror the students' experiences in the sense of you see what works, what students respond to, what fails miserably, and you get a bad effect, and then you just modify your style through that.
Mm-hmm. And for me, I always wanted to be I didn't want to be a mirror image of somebody else. I just wanted to be a polished reflection. So I would always take like what I saw good in somebody else. I was like, oh, I want to be more like that, but I don't want to be like that. And then I would make sure, and then, as I've had different supervisors and different coworkers and, even different young people I'm working with, I take the things that I really found beneficial from that relationship or from that interaction or from whatever they were doing and incorporate that into myself. And then try not to incorporate the other stuff that I didn't like, which is sometimes hard.
Yeah, I really can attribute much to just mentors in this field, right? And you mentioned it earlier, just thinking of the long view of really trying to think about this work, mission, ministry, or whatever around this career as really caring about the future and knowing that the next social workers were right in front of me and this profession. And so I think that drives me to get better. But then I also just had great teachers. So
I think for me, when I left MSAS, I went into a field, as I said, community development, where there weren't a lot of social workers. And so it was really a struggle to identify opportunities where I could observe and learn. And I had wonderful, wonderful bosses. I actually, when I left here, my first full-time job out of work was doing community organizing, and my boss had been a priest for 20 years. And so it was like a really nice segue for me to better understand. He was such a great listener and mentor and supporter, and I really was fortunate and blessed to have him as a mentor throughout a lot of my early learning. But I think, as Mary had mentioned, you have these wonderful mentors, but I also looked to my other fellow students who I'd gone to school with as well. And so similar, I've known Mary for a long time and other fellow alums and social workers, and reaching out and asking what they had done, and a lot of just, I think, learning on my end. And I think that there's always something new and exciting to learn, like time studies. Never even thought about that. That's great. So.
turns out some people decide to leave their phones in the car ed field. That was one of the outcomes of a time study. The student didn't even realize how much, right? I mean, we all know these devices can be addictions, right? And I'm guilty of it myself. And so I didn't need to say it. She saw it and realized she needed to lock up her phone and not bring it into field. And that big concern about, well, what if someone needs to reach me? Well, you have a desk phone. And she realized that. So she gave people her desk phone, and that just allowed her to be more present, which just allowed for more learning, right? It wasn't trying to limit what she was doing, but just more learning. If you only have 20 hours a week.
So you're all in leadership roles in your organizations. What are you seeing as the biggest challenges going forward in our ability to provide significant numbers of quality field education places for the next generation of social workers?
For me, currently in our organization, we've been really fortunate to see a lot of growth under the Affordable Care Act and be able to bring on new staff and develop new programs and open new health centers. But I think always in a leadership role, time is always a challenge for all of us. You have multiple hats and multiple tasks and efforts that you're working on. But I also feel that for the student placement, I think a continued need is, we see a lot of interest. Often we get multiple calls for both first and second year students, and the opportunity and interest in wanting to place more within a public health or community health setting. And while I'd love to do that, there's only, traditionally I can only allow or work with one student at a time. So I would love to see more opportunities for students in public health environments, because I see a lot of trend and interest from students in wanting to do that.
As I reflect on that question, I'm struck by funding cuts in the field of aging and in all of our areas. And so, at first glance, it can feel, you can feel pretty hopeless about some things. But I think this is an opportunity, too, for students, because places do need more qualified staff members to help deliver services. I'm looking out at Melissa, who I work with through Benjamin Rose, and I think of a senior center that sometimes has 1 or 2 staff members. And so the opportunity to bring in a student who's both curious and committed and has a base knowledge of aging needs, we have opportunities that we can look to in the midst of what also feels a real heavy load right now with federal funding.
Yeah, so I mean, in this field, we're always going to have to do more with less. And so it's really, when you make the decision, and as someone said, a mission to take on a student, you have to be willing and know that you're going to have to give that time, right? And so while there's all these different things going on, compartmentalizing it and know that you still have to have that supervision session, you still need to guide them, you still need to do all that. And once you do that and make that mindset, then I just radically accept it and I just do it, and I know that it's important and I make that a top priority. So for me, it's just making sure I get my priorities in line and making sure I do what I got to do.
I would add that I think that you need to develop, as leaders in our organizations, I think that you have to develop a culture in which you think of yourself as a learning place, like some hospitals are teaching hospitals, and it's built into your culture because it does take time. And sometimes staff have the perception that interns are great because they can help them. It's like free labor, cheap labor, et cetera. And you have to really emphasize that as a field site, you have this huge responsibility to someone's education. So you can't just show them how to fill out a form. You have to teach the underlying process that the form is documenting. And it is a time commitment, but I think that if you can incorporate that and embed it in your culture, it's part. And if you don't have it in the culture, it's going to be a challenge to take on field students.
Another trend I often see the last couple of years has been really around policy and advocacy and interest in that from students. And while that's something that I provide, I think that a lot of us already practice that in our roles within our organizations and what our organizations are doing. So I think continuing to create those opportunities to better learn how to advocate, whether it's at the local, state, or federal level, will just, I think, continue for, as Mary mentioned, with federal funding or with different services or support if we anticipate cuts and things like that. That's very essential. For example, Medicaid, I anticipate that an incoming student will be working with us a lot around our advocacy efforts in that regard.
So Lou, you started talking about this, and a lot of our discussion has been around what the individual field instructors, field supervisors can do to create robust learning experiences. When you begin to think about it at an organizational level, because if we think about it, in fact, you are producing the next generation of social workers who become the workforce for many, many organizations, health, social service organizations that could not deliver the programs without the trained workforce. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how can we make this more of an inter-organizational, inter-institutional responsibility, not only the responsibility of the individual social workers and the field office. So thoughts about that. You've begun to touch on it, how how organizations can create cultures of learning and also advocate. Who can they advocate to in your local community? And how do you see ways of kind of notching this up from individual social workers to an organizational level? Do you want to expand, Lou, before I turn it to the others? Because you've talked about developing a culture, a teaching learning culture in the organization.
Well, I think with part of our culture is that interns are treated like employees. We have the same expectations in terms of professionalism, attendance at staff meetings, et cetera. I mean, the key difference, of course, is that for a student, there's room and even, I don't want to say encouragement to fail, but a comfort level in failing and learning, more so than the paid employee has. But I think that if you treat them like employees, then the same type of interagency work that you're doing and advocacy work and networking with other people in the community, they're going to have those opportunities available to them. And it's a great opportunity to use the learning contract to work in some sort of a task objective about interacting with other agencies.
And so, I mean, we try to do a very good job of working very collaboratively amongst different departments within our organization. So if I have a student who's very interested in learning more about like runaway and homeless youth, I can refer them to a colleague and they can go meet with that person, find out what the strategies they use, and then they'll come back and we'll talk about that. And then I do have I've had some interns in the past who are very interested in getting more out into the community and understanding how different collaborative partnerships work and things of that nature. And so I'll provide them with opportunities to go to those meetings and have that discussion. And then, if they're interested in learning more about a particular agency or particular program, we try to figure out who that person would be that they could contact and how we can, develop that relationship too. And really kind of empowering them to look for different opportunities or just to do more research and get more ideas, so.
I think one institutionalized moment for us was when we dedicated 2 cubicles, 2 computers, and 2 phones to interns. It seems simple, but they would always be taken, and I'd be interviewing, and then I'd be saying, I need a phone, and so that made it the expectation that every fall there was going to be 2 new students here, and so that really helped. And that just took advocacy on my part with, at the time, my director. I would say the second component to institutionalize it, to see the people who work above me value interns, because I'm less concerned about myself and the team around me. It's more around the folks making decisions, was around making sure that they had some one-on-one time with the student alone. And so scheduling half-hour meetings where the student could meet with the then director and present on some research project that I thought would be valuable, to your point, Marion, either some value to the administration to see what students bring to the organization. And so I would help frame that, whether it was around looking at new data that came out from the American Community Surveys, something we needed information on, the student had an interest and wanted to learn, and then to remove myself from that conversation and just allow the student to have a 30-minute meeting with a director or a chief, I think has helped us institutionalize a culture of learning.
For our organization, I feel fortunate because we're in the healthcare field. We have a lot of students coming through different medical programs and schools locally, which is wonderful. So that part of that exists. So I do think part of it is capacity. What can the organization certainly take on in terms of bringing on internships or field placements with an organization. But I think other ways that we do that are through our orientation process. And that's something where I've worked at other organizations where we didn't really have a formal orientation process, or it was a smaller organization and kind of learn as you went along. For us, and especially for field placement students that I would work with, or that I do work with, they go through, similar as Lou had mentioned, the same type of process that an employee goes through. So everybody has to complete the same kind of required trainings and things like that. But in addition, we schedule time, as Mary even had mentioned, with different department heads and staff. So it might be the head of our Refugee Health Services team to learn more about what our organization's doing, or with our midwives, or with our chief medical officer, so that we can provide that much more holistic approach and roundabout. I think one of the ways in which you can set a stage really early on for a good learning environment is where the student has all those initial tools to help to communicate, what type of organization am I working in, and what are those services being provided accordingly.
Well, these are all very rich, important ideas, because we've spent a lot of time focusing on what we can do in the individual student, field instructor, supervisory relationship and setting. We're now sort of broadening it to organizations and how we can get organizations on board. Let me open it now to all of you to either ask our panelists to elaborate on anything, or for you to share some of your ideas or your challenges to see what this collective brain power can comment on. So we have a little bit of time where we can have more involvement from the audience here.
Thank you. So I really liked a lot of what I heard, especially about the collaboration in the organizations and making the agency aware, this is an intern, this is sort of a semi-employee type piece. And I think, too, for me, and I've only supervised a few times, but I take it as an obligation to the social work community and to our field to make sure that the people have the tools that they need. And even if it's something that I didn't necessarily see in practice, but just their general well-being. So, sort of pulling from that strength, but I think getting the feedback from the others at the agency too on that. What are they seeing if you're putting them in front of people? So I think I love the models that all of you have, and transparency. I know Lou, so I know what he's doing. He's doing great work. So thank you.
I want to thank the panel. Very good points, and I can hear all the different ideas that really makes our job so rewarding. I know something what we've done differently, I'm in healthcare as well. A lot of times social workers interview social workers. So we actually met with the nurse MBA administrator and developed kind of a business model, interview approach and a scale and everything. Subjectivity goes out the window. And so I was asked to be a participant on this interviewing committee, and two of my former interns, one that graduated this year and the following year, both got hired. And not to say I was biased or anything, but what happened, the administrator, who's very business oriented, said, all these years you've been doing it, why haven't we been hiring our own interns? And she saw the difference, because we interviewed, lots of candidates. And it was kind of like a moment, and I'm like, yes. And so now there's a lot more collaboration. I mean, yes, once we thought there was a good candidate, then we move them up to meet with the team, et cetera. But at the end of the day, really it was up to the social workers interviewing. But really the administrator really started kind of mimicking the fact that we need to really look at who we have, our interns. So the last two actually got hired. So I felt that was kind of my reward. I've been doing this for over 20 years, and hearing a lot of what I taught them come back. It's like my children, kind of like, whoa, I did say that. And the process and the organization and the macro and advocacy, everything that you try to teach that you're not certain they hear, in that interview, all of that came back, and it makes what we do for all of us here. We ought to give all of us a pat in the back. It's really, it's kind of the most exciting part of my job. So thank you very much, and thank you.
Great.
So,
Other examples of good practices? Right behind you.
You know, actually, I'm sitting here thinking, I'm reflecting on my own field experiences 20-some years ago. And I had one opportunity my second year that was great. And I'm listening to all of the things that everybody's talked about, and then reflecting on what I've taken from that experience in being a supervisor and a field instructor myself. And I think what was so wonderful about it is that actually the clinical director at the agency was an instructor here at MSSA at the time. And we always had about 8 to 10 throughout this community mental health agency interns, a variety of folks. So everybody, there'd be 2 or 3 social workers, there might be someone who was working to become a nurse practitioner and or psychiatric nurse, maybe art therapy, a real nice mix. And the stage was always set that the job of the interns was to be interns. And so, I had never really thought about how do you set that up. And I think it was really her. Luckily, she was in a position to set that up and say, this is the way it needs to be here. And so, but it was a wonderful experience because we knew that was what we were there for. So we could go anywhere and say, I want to spend some time this semester working and doing some work here and here, and I want to do this. And so you could really do just about anything. And the other part that was really built in that was a wonderful experience is we had a group, we had someone who didn't have an intern herself. She was an MSSA grad actually as well, who took us all in and facilitated group supervision, where it was an opportunity for us to just sit and talk about our cases and our experience and our trips and falls and to pat each other on the back and tease each other and pull each other up again. And that experience was so rewarding, and in trying to figure out what to take out of that has been helpful today. But I think also to help me think about what do we do in our role, which is I think your question, to help make sure that the intern their job is to be an intern in their internships. And so how can we maybe further advocate for that, despite whether we're a clinician versus a supervisor versus someone here in your agency? How do you do that? That's a question.
Do any of you want to respond?
Something that we learned is to not count on the intern to meet some sort of a requirement. So, for example, for group therapy, there's a 12-to-1 ratio. So if you count on the intern is going to be part of that ratio, that doesn't allow much room for the intern to experiment and to try different things. So we had to have it be like a 12-to-2 ratio in order to accommodate the learning experience. So if you give thought to, like if you're meeting a standard by using an intern, that's not going to give the student much wiggle room.
I mean, same principle, like making sure that we preserve the role of the intern, like making sure that we set the expectation of like, this is what you're supposed to do, and I don't want to hear that somebody else is trying to get them to do something else. So we really, really preserve the role of the intern.
I would agree, although in reflecting on 20 different students, also just knowing that students' strengths and also challenges. There's been students that I know that I wasn't challenging enough because they felt they wanted more responsibility. And so I think through those supervision opportunities, I could really hear that and make adjustments. I can think of one of my last interns ran an entire 12-week class. And this was in her second semester, and she was just chomping at the bit. And she had shadowed me for the first semester, and I just knew it was time, and that I could. So while she did take on the role in that way, I would say is a little different than other interns, I think it serves her well now. She's really launched quickly.
I think the only thing I would add, you made such an excellent point, that being an intern, you're in a learning environment, and so how can you continue to support that? And I was reflecting back on my experience when you said, boy, all those things I remember, and my supervisor always had an open door policy, and so no matter what, they could always come in, and I could always go in and talk about whatever, and he would take as much time as I needed to help to process through different things, and that is something that I hope I still continue to do, but he was just exceptional at it, and it really helped me grow as an individual for sure.
These are wonderful stories. I'm going to go around the country talking about how great field education is in Cleveland. But I don't mean this facetiously, because I have been invited to different parts of the country where the biggest challenge is lack of time. And there's difficulty in getting field placements, and there's difficulty in carving out the time for field education. So from what I'm hearing today, you really are to be congratulated on being so thoughtful and so able to preserve the time and the quality for quality field education. I just want to make a few comments about group, because it's come up a few times that group supervision has from time to time been used as an efficient way of providing field education. Generally, the research shows that students prefer individual instruction. And there's been a fair amount of research on group supervision over the years. But when group supervision is an adjunct, as you were describing, it's offered in addition to individual supervision, it really does provide students with something extra, often around use of self, often around developing a professional identity. A recent, very interesting approach has been, I'm familiar with it in my own city in a few hospitals, where one social worker, not necessarily a field instructor, takes all the students, maybe 6, 7 students, 2 hours a week, and teaches using simulation. You can see that that's a big thing where I'm from. Teaches some of the essential, difficult competencies. So, for example, in a children's rehabilitation hospital, one social worker is teaching breaking bad news. How do you talk to families about the medical diagnosis that they've received and what they can expect happening in the future? And the field instructors have found this extra simulation experience really bolsters what they then can do in their own field instruction. And the students have found it invaluable because it's a very safe way to bungle around and figure out, what to do. So if you're in an organization where you have the resources to offer adjunctive experiences through group, it's a great idea. And finally, I think the one of the overall messages that has come out of the panel and the discussion is the importance of social work leadership, as the 4 of you have obviously been able to demonstrate. Social work leadership in educating whoever is in charge of resources in the organization, educating them about the value of having social work students. So thank you very much to the panel and to the audience for really a wealth of very interesting ideas.